VisualPolitik community, it's a fact. Journalists, the media, and 1,001 YouTube channels are rubbing their hands together. The second era of Donald Trump is here. Don't worry, the boredom is over. Trump's presence in the White House guarantees a steady dose of spectacle. Controversies and dramas are sure to become a daily event, because this time, the new president arrives more determined, with clearer ideas and stronger fellow travelers, as strong as the one you see on the screen, Elon Musk. This time, everything indicates that the world's largest fortune will play a key role in this new administration, and he's expected to do so in one area specifically. I am, of course, talking about the scissors. Republicans have vowed to push through a huge tax cut as quickly as possible to keep the US economy from cooling. And pay attention, because this time they have to move fast. President Trump's 2017 tax bill expires at the end of 2025. If they don't renew it, taxes will go up, which would likely seriously hurt the economy right about the time the midterm elections come around in 2026, which, of course, could give the Democrats a very significant advantage, especially considering that the majority of Senate seats at stake in 2026 are currently in Republican hands, making a Democratic victory particularly painful. And of course, that is something that would also end the term of a president who would face his last 2 years in the Oval Office with his hands virtually tied. And yes, I know you may think it's completely crazy that we're already talking about that possibility just as Trump begins his term in office. But trust me, North American politics is going full speed ahead. Either you move or you get trampled on. In fact, what we're describing is something that has already happened. In his first term, Trump's tax cut didn't come until late 2017, which wasted an entire year and made it easier for Democrats to take the House majority and for Nancy Pelosi to become Speaker. But not this time. Republicans don't want to suffer the same fate. This time, they're going to want to have big policy wins in their first year. So what we can expect for them is to get their acts together and step on the gas. In other words, we can expect them to renew the 2017 tax cut that is about to expire, and even try to go somewhat further, to try to reduce the corporate profits tax somewhat more, to make good on Trump's promise not to tax their own and overtime, at least not entirely, and even, perhaps, limit the capital gains tax somewhat more. This is what we should expect if we take into account all the promises that the new president has made. And also that, in his first term, tax reform was the most successful measure for the economy. And guess what? This is what has created such high hopes. America is not only going to be great, America is going to reach heights never before seen. It's the incredible future that Make America Great Again supporters talk about. However, Houston, we have a problem, or rather two. On the one hand, the federal government's budget gap is out of control. We're talking about a public deficit of 6.4%, and that's at a time when both the economy and state revenues are growing at full speed. But naturally, if revenues are rising, the problem is that government spending is not lagging behind. VisualPolitik community, a lot of industrial policy and infrastructure initiatives have been passed in recent years that aren't exactly cheap. And then, of course, we have the baby boom generation starting to retire. The result? A budget gap of $1.8 trillion. In other words, the US government's budget gap total alone would make it one of the 15 largest economies in the world. This is a serious gaping hole in the US government, a gap that has caused the public debt to exceed $36 trillion. But now, Trump has also promised to lower taxes. And naturally the question is, how on earth do you do that without everything getting out of control and the US debt ending up exploding into a trillion pieces? And pay attention, because there's more to this. This we have identified as the first problem. The second problem is that this huge injection of government money is contributing to economic growth. What do I mean? Well, if you apply austerity for austerity's sake, whether it's for better or worse, economic growth could cool down, something that obviously the Republicans don't want any part of. So the question seems pretty clear. How the hell do you fit the pieces together? Control the deficit, lower taxes, while not cooling the economy? Okay, maybe some of you are now thinking, that magic bullet that Trump is always talking about, that is tariffs. However, that wouldn't be nearly enough. The United States imports about $4 trillion worth of goods and services every year. So even if Trump were to set a general tariff of 10%, we would only be talking about a revenue of about $400 billion compared to a deficit of $1.8 trillion before the tax cut. And what's more, that's assuming that the tariffs will also be applied to the import of services, something that will not happen. They will not reduce imports of goods, and they will not reduce other revenues, such as, for example, the tax on corporate profits. So no, it wouldn't be enough. And to top it off, we're also not taking into account out some of the new president's plans that could cost a lot of money, such as mass deportations of illegal immigrants. So, you know what? This is where the scissors come in. Let's be clear. Donald Trump's success in this second term is going to have a lot to do with whether he's able to pull off his promise to cut taxes and regulations, and to do it without sending the deficit straight into the stratosphere. Well, this is exactly the mission that this new agency will have. It already seems clear that it will not be official, but it has a very bombastic name. I am, of course, talking about the Department of Government Efficiency, also popularly known as DOGE, an initiative that will be piloted by two billionaires, Elon Musk and former presidential candidate Vivek Ramaswamy. Trump himself has gone so far as to call this mission the Manhattan Project of our time. Their goal, supposedly to drastically reduce federal spending, the number of government workers and government regulations. And I say supposedly because we'll see what happens with him, because Trump loves to spend money. Don't forget that in his first term, he fattened the public debt by a brutal $8 trillion, 40% of all the debt created by all previous presidents combined. And we're talking about just 4 years. And not only that, on top of that, the current challenge is titanic. To give you an idea, just to prevent the debt from going faster than the economy in the long term, the government would have to cut $800 billion a year, 12% of all current government spending. And that, let me stress, would only stabilize the public debt. Because to achieve a balanced budget, the adjustment would have to be much larger. In that case, we'd be talking about $1.5 trillion a year. In other words, more than 20% of all public spending would have to be cut. And that is, as long as such a cut would not affect revenue collection and taxes would not be cut. Otherwise, the adjustment would have to be even greater. Put another way, the US public accounts have gotten so out of control that to balance the budget, the country would have to make an adjustment almost as big as Milei's in Argentina. This is no joke.
I am gravely concerned about the fiscal health of our nation and the growing federal debt. Adding to that debt is irresponsible. We cannot continue to say yes to every new program and new spending proposal and expect to escape the consequences.
And it appears things have not been handled well. Do you want an example? Well, take the case of NASA. For years, this agency developed rockets to send into space, which led it to accumulate facilities all over the country. We're talking about more than 5,000 buildings, including 38 engine test centers. And don't forget that today, NASA no longer manufactures the rockets, but contracts services from companies like SpaceX. So today, many of these facilities are no longer in use or are obsolete, and yet they are still open and costing the taxpayer a lot of money in maintenance and salaries. Why is this happening? Well, because no congressman wants to bear the cost of having to lay off workers in his territory. So they move to avoid it at all costs, even if that means keeping facilities open that serve virtually no purpose.
It is politically impossible for an agency head to even consider closing a major facility. It simply can't be done because Congress wouldn't allow it.
And all this without even mentioning the grants and contracts NASA has awarded in recent years to support environmental justice, diversity, and inclusive practices. Regardless of whether or not you are in favor of such grants, they have nothing to do with space exploration. And so it goes on. It's a trickle of public money that affects virtually all federal agencies and departments. It's not something unique to the United States either. In practically all countries, something very similar is happening. Well, now, Elon Musk has said that the Department of Government Efficiency's goal is to cut $2 trillion. Let's see, he hasn't clarified whether he is talking about an annual cut or a 10-year cut, which is how these things are usually measured in the United States. If it were over 10 years, we're talking peanuts. And if it were per year, it's probably not something viable. Because at this point, we come to the huge problem with public accounts. The fact is that most spending is not discretionary. That is, it's not determined by each year's budget, but fixed by different laws. We're talking above all about social spending committed by legislation and which the government cannot propose to change when it prepares the budget. This is what is known as mandatory spending. And look at this. The US federal government spent $6.75 trillion in the 2024 fiscal year. Well, just over a third of all spending went to Medicare and Social Security. Another 10% went to interest on the debt, and about another 25% went to Medicaid and other social programs for low-income people. All this, as I tell you, is fixed by law. The scope for action is small. In fact, Trump himself has said that he's not going to touch Medicare or Social Security. As it turns out, this is point 14 of the 20 promises of the Make America Great Again plan that he presented in writing during the campaign. Take a look.
fight for and protect Social Security and Medicare with no cuts, including no changes to the retirement age.
In the end, all this brings us to discretionary spending, the spending that is negotiated each year with the budgets, to $1.7 trillion, which is already less than the $2 trillion in cuts announced by Musk, and is also less than the government's trailing fiscal deficit, which, remember, is over $1.8 trillion. But not only that, it's that almost half of all this discretionary spending is military spending, and it doesn't seem that Trump comes with the idea of cutting the budget to the military, quite the opposite. Thus, there is only a little more than $900 billion left, where the government could look to cut back. And of course, no matter how hard the adjustment would be, it would be totally insufficient. They would not even be able to prevent the public debt from continuing to grow. So, would it be possible that Trump might try to cut some of the mandatory welfare benefits for the less well-off? Could be, but there's one problem. In the United States, a 1974 law is in force that obliges the government to spend the funds approved by Congress. And as I told you, the mandatory spending is already approved by law. It's not negotiated year to year. In order to change it, Trump would have to get Congress to change the legislation. And guess what? Nobody is in the mood to get into that mess. Not even Trump himself. Among other things, because in the United States, 73 million people and voters receive retirement, disability, or social support benefits. 68 million people are in Medicare, and 72 million people are in Medicaid. So let's be honest, over 80% of all federal government spending is interest on the debt, military spending, and social entitlements. So either we cut social spending, or we're wasting our time. Besides, social spending is getting more and more cumbersome. Do you see the graph? Well, remember that the deficit was 6.4% in the last year, so you do the math. Of course, many expenses can be cut, and many expenses that should not be incurred can be cut. That would reduce cholesterol, and that is always good. The problem is that it wouldn't change much. At the same time, Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy have also targeted state-funded employees. Or rather, they want to cut public employees. But we're back to the same thing. Even if they do manage to save a lot of money, in the end, we're still talking about peanuts. And above all, we have to take into account that there are not that many public employees in the federal government, including the Postal Service, which is largely self-supporting, and the military. We're talking about 2.3 million people working for the federal government. Of these, nearly 500,000 are veterans, issues that Trump also does not want to cut. So let me stress it, this Department of Government Efficiency could accomplish a lot of things, and if they do it right, save the taxpayer a lot of money. The problem is that they are going to have a very difficult time reducing the government's budget gap. As for how to pay for a possible tax cut, well, it's not clear how to do it. So perhaps the hope lies, above all, in his second mission, slashing of standards. I'm talking about regulations, the other great cholesterol to which politicians and civil servants are completely addicted. VisualPolitik community, regulations are increasing all the time. It's a common pattern in all countries, and the cost is increasing. Although regulation in the United States is not as intense as in the European Union, this does not mean that it's not burdensome. Some estimates suggest that the cost for companies just to understand, adapt, and comply with changing regulations exceeds 8% of GDP. Just to comply with the regulations passed in the last 4 years, the private sector has had to spend about $1.8 trillion according to some estimates made in recent months. And the truth, we only have to take a look at the Federal Code of Regulations, the government bulletin, which has more and more pages. To make matters worse, many of these regulations are not approved by Congress, but are implemented by the more than 400 agencies that make up the US government. In other words, by the civil servants. And not only that, what's more, many of these new regulations that are constantly being issued and changed not only generate an enormous cost to the productive economy, but many of them are also seriously slowing down innovation. In the end, approval times for such things as new drugs, new energy projects, new infrastructure, new factories, or even the development of military equipment keep getting longer and longer. This makes any development desperately slow and expensive. Of course, in the end, the economic impact is enormous. And here, yes, is where this Department of Government Efficiency could play a key role. Although, don't think that Trump fell short of passing regulations in his first term either. The first 2 years were quiet, but then he started to release regulation at full speed. Hopefully this time it will be different. But naturally, the presence of Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy also generates other doubts. What am I talking about? Well, look at Biden's farewell address, for example.
I want to warn the country of some things that give me great concern. This is a dangerous concentration, and that's a dangerous concentration of power in the hands of a very few ultra-wealthy people, and the dangerous consequences if their abuse of power is left unchecked. Today, an oligarchy is taking shape in America of extreme wealth, power, and influence that literally threatens our entire democracy, our basic rights and freedoms, and a fair shot for everyone to get ahead.
What does Joe Biden mean? Well, you can see the point is that only Congress can create new departments of the federal government, and that means that any official appointment has to go through an approval process. And furthermore, those responsible have to comply with legislation on conflicts of interest, transparency, and limits on their business dealings with the government or entities related to it. However, Trump has already confirmed that this Department of Government Efficiency will not be part of the government. It will be an external advisory body, which will not require its heads to go through any approval process or be subject to the limitations established by law. And this despite the fact that they are supposedly going to supervise and give orders to government officials. This poses a risk, the emergence of a clear conflict of interests that could lead to an oligarchy that seeks preferential treatment with the government. Keep an eye out for this. It's a concern that many analysts are now shining a light on, and they may be quite right. Take Elon Musk, for example. He is by far one of the entrepreneurs most dependent on Uncle Sam in his business dealings. So much so that, according to The Economist, he may have received government contracts and benefits worth some $40 billion. For example, SpaceX has received nearly $20 billion in government contracts, and Tesla has made far more money selling emissions credits created by public regulations than it has selling cars. We're talking more than $10 billion since 2015. In other words, without the support of money and government regulations, it's likely that his empire would not exist. And of course, now Musk is going to decide the regulations of an industry in which he himself is involved. And keep in mind, this is not only the opinion of many analysts and many Democrats, but also of many investors and many Republicans. In fact, this explains why, since Trump's victory, Tesla's shares have skyrocketed. It's estimated that the total value of Musk's business has increased by 50% in recent months, precisely because of this idea that he's now going to benefit directly from his ties with the government. And if you think about it, to tell you the truth, that's a little bit of a shock. And what do Musk and Ramaswamy say? Well, that they're not actually really going to be part of this department. That they're helping Trump put highly qualified people in place to do this job. People he can count on, of course. And so they're just going to be advisors to this body. That is, advisors to an advisory team. The truth is that due to influence, political ambition, and because they themselves are going to put people at the top, everything indicates that they are going to be the ones who will really pilot it. And I'm not going to deny that this worries me personally. We love the idea that this body emerged from a wish, and I hope that this time Trump will be different and really look to splash spending, taxes, and regulation. But we are worried about conflicts of interest and things not being done cleanly. I'm not going to deny those things are likely to happen. In any case, the Trump era is beginning again, and this is one of its great promises. In this video, we have seen the positives, the negatives, and the possibilities of this new kind of body that is emerging with a very clear mission: cutting. Will they succeed? And how do you think it will turn out? Will they manage to carry out a major adjustment in public spending and regulation? Let's hope so. For now, tell us what you think about all this in the comments, and let's start a debate. And if this video has been interesting for you, don't forget to like and subscribe to VisualPolitik if you haven't already done so yet. Thank you for watching, all the best. See you next time.